All right. Cool. Well, first of all, I would like to thank you all for coming out to our talk. So my name is, as Lynn mentioned, my name is Deana Brown, and I co-authored this paper with my advisor, Becky Grinter, who will join me at the end, while a graduate student at Georgia Tech. I've since then moved on, and I'm at Google, so welcome to my hometown. So today I'll be discussing work I did with Burmese refugees community within the United States. So the talk is titled Designing for Transient Use, a Human-in-the-Loop Translation Platform for Refugees. So in this talk, I'll discuss sort of the motivation for the study, that being the challenges resettling refugees in the U.S. face. So I will detail in our initial explorations into the lives of resettling refugees through participant observation as volunteers at a refugee agency. I will then discuss the iterative design and consequent deployment of Rivrtran, so a refugee IVR translation tool to scaffold communication between mentors and their refugee families. Finally, I will discuss the impact and implications of use that Rivrtran brought about through the lens of the potential impact it has on livelihood, and close with a discussion of the notion of what we call designing for transient use. So over 50 million people worldwide have actually been forced to abandon their home countries due to a host of reasons that include political instability in their home country, discrimination and persecution, extreme poverty, natural disasters, and a host of other factors. So visions of, better economic possibilities, freedom, and security may draw such individuals to receiving countries such as the United States, which formally resettles the largest number of migrants worldwide. So anyone who's kept up with the news these days will realize that the path to resettlement is a journey. One doesn't simply leave one's country, arrive to the other, and move on with life. Resettlement in the U.S. In particular requires refugees to go through a formal referral and screening, very thorough screening process. Worldwide, only 1% of refugees are actually submitted for resettlement to other countries, and an even smaller number are granted resettlement. This year in the U.S., upwards of 85,000 refugees will actually arrive for resettlement here. This is up from previous years that the cap was previously at 70,000 per year. So imagine you're a new family arriving. What you face is exactly 90 days within which you'll have to gain self-sufficiency, find your own means of financial support, because after this, your federal financial support actually ends. So for anyone who's migrated to another country, you realize that that's not a lot of time. And over this 90-day period, you will actually need to interact with well over 24 people, from caseworkers, a host of other individuals, lawyers, and even mentors. So mentors who, along with refugees, mentors who are sort of paired with refugee families arriving were the focus of our work. So resettlement agencies actually rely a lot on volunteer labor. Mentors who are often American families, they'll pair with refugees to provide familial support to help these families get acclimated to the U.S. and get tasks done such as learning how to access public transportation or registering for a library card or even getting a driver's license, things that will help them to achieve self-sufficiency as quickly as possible. But there's one huge barrier that they face. Many of them may not actually speak any English on arrival, yet their need to communicate with people in English is at its most critical peak. In speaking with the coordinators at the agencies we volunteered with, language barrier is one of the main impact on refugees and on a refugee's ability to quickly rebuild their lives post-migration. These agencies often rely on interpreters to mediate communication with the new families, but they only have a few on staff, and they can only be present for really critical tasks. So this service is not going to be extended to the interactions between volunteers and mentors. So we had the research question of, having gotten a base understanding of what some of the challenges and barriers are for resettling refugees, we wanted to understand if there was a place for communication tools in sort of mitigating some of the communication barriers that we observe, so language, literacy, and otherwise, in these refugee support networks. So I'll shift to a discussion of the research. I wanted to note that we actually started this work back in 2014, prior to the latest refugee crisis. So we did a two-part study that started off with an exploration into some of the barriers and opportunities for mediating engagement in these support networks. Having identified, as I mentioned before, language as key issues, we then launched into sort of an iterative design along with the agencies and a number of other individuals we spoke with, into the iterative design and deployment of a communication scaffolding tool to mediate the refugee mentor communication. So our first question was sort of, wanting to get a better sense firsthand of what some of the barriers were to communication. And I mentioned a number of them, so I won't go into detail. So, language, literacy, a lot of them may have dropped out of primary schooling, and so they have limited literacy. Refugees tend to be very busy, working a lot, trying to get a lot of things into place. And then accessibility to technology on arrival. So again, we focused on that initial 90-day period. Is very limited. They may not have email or a computer. They are usually given a phone on arrival, so that's your best means of getting access to them. So we sort of, as I mentioned before, did first-hand observation. So we did participant observation over a 6-month period, serving as a volunteer mentor with a refugee agency. To gain a sense firsthand of the experience of arriving refugees. We did some amount of in-home shadowing with mentors during their visits with their paired families. And throughout that process, we interviewed a number of people, including the coordinators, the mentors themselves, new families arriving, as well as the interpreters and staff, to just get a holistic view of the challenges for different individuals. So following this, we wanted to understand what factors we needed to take into consideration when trying to design some sort of communication tool to mediate the refugee mentor communication in attempts to overcome some of these barriers. So following this 6-month participant observation, some of the things we highlighted were, on the part of mentors, they really wanted they really wanted a tool that would be able to support what we call, opportunistic and emphatic messaging. So the conversations we take for granted, being able to text someone and say, how is your day? Do you need anything? Are you okay? Sort of these daily conversations was really hard to convey to someone who didn't speak English. So that was a huge need for the mentors. The system needed to be voice-based to overcome some of the literacy challenges we mentioned refugees may face. And then finally, the agency actually wanted us to sort of balance the dependency on interpretation. They didn't want a tool that would be sort of they didn't want a tool that refugees would need to depend on long term. So they really emphasized that we sort of balance that. So following a host of iterative design with the agencies, we led to the system we call Rivrtran, so Refugee IVR Translation. It's primarily IVR-based, as we mentioned, to overcome language and access barriers, since they could simply dial a number to get access to their messages or to send messages. So mentors and refugees could exchange these messages, and whenever there's a language barrier between the two individuals, it gets routed to volunteer interpreters that we recruited for the appropriate bilingual volunteer interpreter who would get like a notification on their phone. They could quickly do the translation, and then it gets routed accordingly. Now, there was a web client to sort of supplement the experience and provide additional features. the prompts for families, for instance, we included it in both English and Burmese to sort of reinforce the need to learn English. So there are some features that we specifically designed for based on the recommendations of the agency. So that's just another view, again, of the system and our training process with showing people how to use it and so on. So the final question was around deployment. So wanting to understand the impact use of the system could have, specifically focusing on livelihood strategies and outcomes. So things such as the types of capital, human, physical, financial that it may or may not enable in a short 90-day time frame. So we launched into the deployment. As I mentioned, it's a 3-month deployment intentionally to mimic the 90-day period we imagine allowing refugees or issuing this tool for refugees to use. We did interviews pre, mid, and post with our families and the mentors and sort of, tracked livelihood tasks. So we understood sort of how the strategies they used beforehand, and then we assessed the strategies they used while the system was in place to see if there are any changes. So we had 9 families sign up. We focused specifically on Burmese families since with each additional new culture or language, it adds an extra layer of complexity to the project. So this is just an overview of our families. About 5 of them had been in the US for under a year, which is closer to the use case we imagine Rivrtran to be. But we did enroll some who had been here much longer, so the max was 4 years. They are all tend to be laborers at production plants and large families. So over the 90-day period, we sort of conducted, at the end, conducted log and content analysis of the Rivrtran data to understand frequencies and interactions and themes that we saw. On average, messages were exchanged about once a week, so hence the lower numbers, to coincide with the weekly visit of a mentor, so it was not an everyday activity. Additionally, the majority were sent by newcomers who actually had been in the US for under a year, so this mostly accounts for 5 or so of the families. As we saw that families who are here longer, as I'll mention later, did not have as strong of a need for such a system. 30% of messages sent by all individuals via the system were either in the form of phatic messages, greetings and wishes, or check-ins on a person's needs or status. And the goal of this sort of messaging was to keep the lines of communication open, as it really helped to build or reinforce the refugee-mentor relationship. And then we saw a number of different message types. Rivrtran was really suitable for informational purposes, so things such as explaining more advanced topics to a refugee, for instance, tax fraud. They get targeted a lot for that sort of thing. And conveying messages following a doctor visit that really needed to be conveyed, in a way that the families could understand. Lacking interpreters ourselves, we even tried to administer interview questions via the system as a workaround. So in the paper, I discussed the current landscape of translation options available here, ranges from informal to formal. We found that Rivrtran really sat in this asynchronous informal space, sort of acting as a bilingual friend, but with the added element of privacy that, some conversations you may not want your friend to hear. But the informality allowed the interpreters to use more broken forms of language, which we found formal Burmese, for instance, many of our families really didn't understand it, so they had challenges when speaking to professional interpreters. So, we found that our volunteer translators would tailor their messages to sort of suit the respondents, and over time they kind of understood the differences between, the people that they were responding to and how to convey messages to them. So This is just one of the mentor's comments that it says, Rivrtran really lets it be a conversation between my mentee and I, and not my mentee and this other person he knows that he doesn't want to tell his problems to. So for him, this sort of asynchronous informal tool was useful. So I will outline some specific shifts that we observed with use of Rivrtran with regards to, as we mentioned before, livelihood strategies of these refugee families. So we noticed, so as we said, we observed beforehand some of the strategies they used and how they were interacting, and we noticed certain shifts. So we noticed a shift from missed appointments to mediated requests. So before use of Rivrtran, refugees would just not show up to appointments because they couldn't convey simple things like, I don't yet have my insurance, or I don't have transportation. And we saw where they actually embraced the system to explain to their mentors, like beforehand, some of the challenges they might face, so the mentors could actually step in and mediate requests. We saw a shift from going with the flow to goal-oriented visits. So our mentors explained, just having to show up and not really having an agenda, or being able to discuss with the families things they could help them with. With Rivrtran, they were able to explain beforehand, like, look, we're going to try to get your child enrolled into school. You need to have these documents prepared, so when I come, we'll actually be able to complete that. So they could, have more goal-oriented visits and actually get important tasks done on time. We saw a shift from confusing communication to cultural clarification. So this really, the volunteer interpreters really play this additional layer of providing cultural clarification. For instance, we had a mentor who continuously asked, do you need help with anything? And her mentees just kept saying no, to the point where the interpreter reached out and said, tell this mentor that they just have to insist. It's not like in America, you ask, do you want coffee? Someone says no, and you just live with it. You have to ask 3 times, and at the 3rd time you said, look, I'm bringing you coffee. And that's sort of the expectation. And this actually worked and improved sort of the relationship, I think, over time, and the ability of the mentor to actually help this family. And we saw it in a number of other cases. And then finally, from staying within one's comfort bubble to confident communication. So I think use of the system really picked up about week 4. So week 3 to 4, we saw the families actually being a bit more confident in communicating. The element of it being asynchronous helped a bit, that it wasn't real time, to kind of in building their confidence with communicating with someone, from a different culture and language. And of course, the added layer of them knowing that their messages would get translated. So I touched on, barriers, factors to consider when we built this tool, and then some of the shifts that we noticed. Finally, I'll end with talking about the notion of designing for transient use. We didn't go in thinking we would build something that, intentionally we'd not want to last or to have an impact longer term. But it ended up being this way. So designing for transient use is sort of the idea that a particular technology is not in and of itself a solution to a challenge, but rather a transitory means to a more permanent end. So in designing for transient use, we can benefit from a combination of existing approaches. For instance, instructional scaffolding pulled from the learning sciences, in which the idea of fading, the gradual removal of instructional scaffolding put in place as a student progresses to a self-regulated independent learner is sort of integral. So in the same sense, a technology that we develop will be relevant in light of the challenge, but if and when the challenge is addressed, the tool becomes less relevant to the user, and eventually use of it is discontinued. So this fading away sort of meant to help refugees fit in with existing communication practices rather than really relying on specialized tools long term. Secondly, taking into consideration value-sensitive design approach can help to expose some of these values embedded, making it transparent up front that this is meant to be a tool that fades over time. And in future work, we could I explore more of the notion of inconvenient interactions. So uncover ways to promote language learning through the system. For instance, it could require refugees to respond in English commands to get access to their messages, and fade away the bilingual prompts over time. So fade away, the Burmese prompts that we included. And finally, the notion of designing for transient use would also require rethinking the metrics for success, which is often measured as use of a system. But in our case, non-use was also a positive metric, as we saw families who had been here longer didn't have a need, and also over time, the need sort of diminished for the newer refugees. So that was also a positive metric. I think we have maybe a minute for questions.
Rush the mic.
Can you tell us more about... Okay, sorry. Thank you for the great presentation. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the volunteer translator aspect. How did you recruit them? Were they very involved? Did they stay for a long time? That's a lot of questions.
Oh, okay, so that's valid. So the idea is that a system like this would scale with crowdsourced volunteers over time, but we had to start out small. We reached out to members in the network, different agencies, and they sort of recommended people who had been in the U.S. for longer term, who spoke the languages of these families. We reached out to them, and they were willing to enroll. There are definitely, in terms of quality, there are differences, and we addressed that over time. So, for instance, one person we unenrolled because they weren't as quick and responsive. So there are definitely... So yes, for the most part, the rest remained through the entire 90 days. It was also a 90-day commitment, so they knew that, okay, it's not long-term. They could end after. Thank you.